Christian Eucharist promises a lot and delivers very little. You have to believe. Faith is not necessary to experience what psychedelics have to teach. You don't have to believe. You can be as skeptical as you want. Famous ethnologist Mircea called it the archaic techniques of ecstasy, and it certainly is archaic in the sense that it's probably our oldest religion, but it's much more than a religion. It's actually a set of practices for achieving altered states of consciousness, whether with the use of drugs or the use of other kinds of techniques like ecstatic drumming and sometimes self-flagellation, or sometimes, different types of, physical stress. But the basic idea of shamanism is to achieve an altered state of consciousness, and not simply to have the experience. The shaman actually uses the altered state to access a transpersonal realm, a realm of spirits or supernatural forces, which can maybe allies of some kind, which he or she can manipulate, communicate with, obtain information from, to help the community or an individual.
Shamans are medicine men, I guess, in Western parlance, and so shamanism is what shamans do. They beat drums, they take drugs, they dance, and they cure people, or they attempt to cure people. They interpret dreams, they find lost objects.
It harkens back to a time when things like psychotherapy and medicine and magic and religion and all of these things weren't even, fully formed concepts. So the shaman kind of combines all of these roles of he's a priest and a doctor and a psychotherapist, and also often a poet and an artist, and someone that gives expression to the cultural myth of the culture. So and I keep saying he, and that's, it should be clear there are shamanesses as well, or women shaman. It's not a gender-specific kind of thing. But the figure of the shaman is a important spiritual figure in these non-traditional in these traditional societies, in these indigenous societies, respected and a little bit feared, because the shaman is the odd person. The shaman is the person who is in direct contact with the transpersonal and is kind of the interface for the culture and the rest of the people. He or she is the person that gets to actually dialogue and travel in these realms, and they often use psychotropic plants to do this. Not invariably, but quite often.
It's quite clear that different kinds of hallucinogenic plants and substances were used, including from the bufo toad. Peter first did some examination of this among the Olmec people. So this is before the classic Maya civilization, back around 1200 BC. And the bufo toad can be kind of a 5-MeO-DMT can be extracted from the glands on the shoulder of the toad.
There's another compound out there called bufotenine, which was first discovered in frog skin, actually, and it's got some kind of psychoactivity. It's a little hard to really pin that down. But it's a naturally occurring, tryptamine as well, though. It's found in blood and brain and cerebrospinal fluid and urine, any body fluid in animals in which it's been looked for.
So they were clearly using psilocybin mushrooms. They were clearly using the 5-MeO-DMT extracted from the bufo toad, and possibly a more close analog of DMT itself. I mean, there's some discussion around the difference between 5-MeO-DMT and regular DMT, but actually modern explorers with these substances have reported that there are qualitatively different experiences, but both can be pretty soul-shaking. So I think within this context, then, you had a whole array of other hallucinogenic plants being used, the morning glory. The Mazatec Indians today, when Gordon Wasson visited the Mazatec and Mixe regions of Oaxaca in the 1950s, it started this whole revolution in understanding the scope and the depth of the sacred plants that were being used. So you have Salvia divinorum, for example, is a plant that was used by the Mazatec Indians and is still used today. That's also where the sacred mushroom cult, the psilocybin mushroom cult, was rediscovered, a place where the sacred mushroom cult apparently survived up until modern times.
Part of the fear that society at large has of psychedelic drugs is that the only framework that we have to process these experiences through in Western culture is that of competitive drinking. Competitive drinking is sort of the standard that we use to measure what it's like to alter consciousness. And I think the shamanistic perspective or shamanistic worldview can give us a new perspective on how to process these experiences and show how valuable that they can be. The shamanic perspective essentially would say that drugs are not the ideal way to alter your consciousness, and you shouldn't alter your consciousness with any of these types of substances until you at least first master altering your consciousness through other means, such as the use of drums, dancing, paying attention to your dreams.
There's all sorts of different ways of attaining altered states, through plants and drugs, through trance, meditation, hypnosis, drumming, starvation, fasting, exhaustive exercise, all kinds of things. And in terms of an entheogen, what I would define as an entheogen, I'm not fond of the term because it kind of requires that you have a belief in theos, which is God or divinity. I think that the term psychedelic is just a bit more descriptive of what these drugs or plants, do or what they manifest. Psychedelic means mind manifesting. And one could argue that the phenomena one encounters on a psychedelic drug experience are either internally generated or are externally independent and freestanding. I think it still kind of dispenses with theological problems that are accompanied by calling a drug something that generates, divinity within, if you don't believe in divinity.
It means God within, generating God within, and inside theos, God, and generate, so that which generates God inside a person. So, and it's a class of drugs formerly called psychedelic, but it's a way of sort of softening the bad press of the word psychedelic. And especially it's to separate it from sort of the party aspect of taking a drug and going crazy, and showing that these drugs have a spiritual side to them, if you can find it.
A term that I prefer is shamanic plant or shamanic medicine, because it's a plant, a psychoactive plant, usually a psychedelic or a hallucinogen, that is used in one of these shamanic traditions, right? So it's appropriate to call it a shamanic medicine, although the very same plant and the very same substance could be not shamanic if you're not using it in a shamanic context. If you're using it recreationally or taking it in a rave or some other situation, it's not really a shamanic medicine anymore. It's still the same substance, but if you're talking about substances that are used specifically sort of in this shamanic context, then I like shamanic medicine. I have problems with the term entheogen, although I know that it's gotten, more popular. After Carl Ruck, who was a classicist, and Jonathan Ott and some other people proposed it as an alternative to hallucinogen. Entheogen means manifesting the God within, in theos, within and God. And that's fine, except they don't always do that.
I don't like the word because I'm a Buddhist and I don't believe in gods, So, it's to me it's something which helps you to reach your full potential. You don't need to introduce the idea of God.
I like the term because I have turned very mystical, since taking LSD. And so my outlook is more skewed in that direction. I think that what Groff said was that it was a non-specific amplifier of your mental states. The psychedelic or hallucinogen or fantastica, the psychotomimetic, all of these qualities that have been ascribed to the same class of sacraments that we now refer to as entheogens. I think it's closer for me to the ultimate purpose for which these substances can be used. The capacity for the human being to experience infinite love and total self-forgiveness. A sense of deep interconnectedness with the planet and with all people and with the cosmos, this plasticity of our identity and helping us to see into realms that perhaps are both ancient because they're the archetypal divine imagination, and they're ever fresh, because it is transcendental presence that is the creator, the artist, the cosmic artist,
Entheogen. That means connecting with God. I've been searching for God all my life. I was a practicing Catholic for many, many years. And you would think that psychedelics, being mind manifesting, would show you the God you've been worshiping. The closest I ever got to God was that, hey Nick, you're God. You're an aspect of divinity that's looking out at this, a little spy for God, and so enjoy it. I said, well, that's a twist. I've been looking for a God outside me, and here I learned that I'm one of God's apostles in a way. What a surprise! So that's what I learned from psychedelics. That at least that's a hypothesis. So pay attention, was the message. Pay attention, Nick. You're collecting data for God. Look with God's eyes upon the world.
So the term hallucinogen is inaccurate. The term psychotomimetic is inaccurate. The term entheogen is, it all depends on circumstances. My personal preference is I like psychedelic because even though the term carries all this cultural baggage, and everything's psychedelic. That's kind of something left over from the 60s. But in the strict sense, psychedelic means mind manifesting. And I like the term because it leaves it open. I mean, these substances certainly manifest the mind in some aspect. And we don't have We don't have any argument with that. But how they manifest it, depends on set and setting. And like these other terms, sort of are more specifically related to set and setting. And they also show how difficult it is to really linguistically kind of put this in a box, characterize what they do. Sometimes they're mystical, sometimes they're induce psychosis. Sometimes they don't do much of anything at all, but they always manifest the mind in some way. So I like psychedelic. If it could just be divorced from, all the connotations that it's come to have in our culture.
I think it's almost inevitable that psychedelics have been playing a part in religious, mystical experiences since the beginning of time. They are a powerful way for human beings to blow their little egos out of the water and contact the divine.
I mean, one thing, the whole of spirituality has its roots, ancient roots, in the shamanic traditions. We still have those traditions, and a huge number of them are based on whatever the indigenous psychedelic happens to be in that area. Because what could be more natural than you pick up a mushroom or something like that, you ingest it, and my God, you're having visions. You're seeing life in a new way. You're seeing through the appearances. You have a greater understanding, or at least the confines of your common sense understanding is exploded. And it's transformational.
They elicit a whole spectrum of psychological effects. Probably the ones that people find most interesting as far as alterations of consciousness. They have profound perceptual effects, emotional effects, cognitive effects. They have effects on your sense of self and on your relationship to your body and to your will. So they kind of cut across the entire spectrum of human consciousness.
It's rare that people rush to repeat it, over and over again regularly. It's not that you have a craving to take the drug. You have a curiosity about the experience, and you often have to overcome your reluctance to take the drug in order to have that. You see this with ayahuasca very strongly. If you drink lots of ayahuasca, you actually develop a physiological aversion syndrome. And this is well known where with other substances where it tastes so bad and you get sick and all that, and you actually, really don't want to consume it, but you do, and somehow you always get it down, and you're always glad you did, because you overcome the aversion and you learn so much from it, but it's definitely not addicting. Quite the opposite.
I think it is possible for people to have an abusive relationship with a psychedelic drug, although compared to the other drugs of abuse, that's certainly a lot less common. For example, the kinds of relationships that most people have with heroin or alcohol or tobacco, those kinds of drugs. Psychedelics, as a rule anyway, tend to be taken sparingly, once a week, once a month, once a year, as opposed to daily. And in fact, in the case of most of the classical psychedelic drugs, like LSD, psilocybin, DMT, if you take them regularly, you quickly develop tolerance, and you stop responding, especially strongly after the second or third day that you take a psychedelic drug. That's not quite the case with DMT, but the debilitating effects of DMT, tend to limit its repetitive habitual use as well.
No, there's no evidence that entheogens are addictive. I mean, ayahuasca or mushrooms or peyote are definitely, or iboga, are definitely not addictive substances. I mean, you can take them and not take them again for years. I mean, they can be a little bit psychologically addictive, like any experience. If somebody really loves it, they may want to go back and have the experience again and again. But generally, you really don't find abusive patterns with people who make use of these substances.
Look in your own pharmacopoeia, look at the drugs that you're taking and note their side effects. And how many people a year have died from inhaling marijuana? Goose egg. Now, look at how many people die from drinking alcohol. You've got hundreds and thousands of people. You've got the people who are completely distraught over the alcohol addiction and things like this. It's countless billions of dollars and millions of lives. Or, think of the people that get creamed when the drunk driver, hurts someone. So there's so many repercussions that are much worse with alcohol, and yet it's legal. And so the idiocy of our current position on cannabis is really sad. But my prayer is that the grassroots movement will continue to show its obvious advantage to our culture by a kind of strict integration and taxing and, so making it a legally available substance, which I think would also make us a little more willing to note the importance of the entheogens, because in a sense it's a mild entheogen, cannabis.
At the same time, we've conflated them with other substances like heroin and speed and cocaine, which are more addictive, more artificial, where we've taken, in the case of heroin and cocaine, we took naturally occurring plant substances, but then we did a chemical process to them to kind of amp up the active component and separate it. So I have a friend, Morgan, who's an herbalist, and he makes a distinction between the whole plant medicine approach that indigenous people were mostly using, and our kind of attitude of just isolating the agent that causes a certain reaction and then amplifying that effect so that it leads to addictive patterns.
A culture is what it eats, and an individual's personality is often largely a reflection of their diet. There has not been a human culture that did not bear upon it the stamp of its relationship to certain plants which altered the individual and mass psyche. We can think of numerous examples, the influence, for instance, of sugar on the growth of 19th century mercantilism, or the way in which the British manipulated opium policy in the Far East, or, as you mentioned, alcohol, which has always been the drug of choice in Western culture. Who can imagine modern industrial office culture without coffee? These are major drug dependencies that have placed their stamp on the lives of millions and millions of people. It's simply that we choose to linguistically define it in such a way that the effect is not something most people are cognizant of.
It's funny that all of these things are lumped under one label, drugs. I come from a sort of a peasant family. Both my parents were farmers and were just immigrants, basically. And when my mother found out, I was in California, that I took drugs, it broke her heart. And there was no way that I could explain to her what it was I was doing, because that word drug just had such an impact on her mind that it was about the worst thing her firstborn son could ever do. And it was, it was one of the saddest things in my life that I could not explain to Mom what it was I was doing. Mom was a very religious person. She went to Catholic church every day, and I could not find a way to tell her that I was doing the same thing that she was doing. And I still, would not know how to tell Mom, what the difference was between her going to church and me taking entheogens, searching for God through chemicals.
There's no such thing as a bad drug, right? Because a drug is just a drug. It's a substance with certain properties. It has no moral qualities. The only thing that has moral qualities is human behavior. And there is lots of bad human behavior with respect to drugs. And there's lots of bad human behavior with respect to all kinds of things, and good human behavior too. I mean, again, this comes back to, the context. So the whole war on drugs idea and the idea, it has nothing to do with protecting people from toxic substances. If that were the purpose of the war on drugs, tobacco and alcohol, would be prohibited tomorrow. And yet the structure of the law, not that prohibition would do any good, and I'm not advocating that, right? But if that were really the agenda for drug control, they would say, well, these are clearly the most harmful drugs. These are the ones that are killing the most people, so they should be strictly regulated. But in fact, the way the law is set up, the FDA is not even allowed to classify tobacco and alcohol as a drug.
There are these science fiction cliches like, there is some knowledge man should not know. So probably there are probably horrible things like huge devils or that places where you shouldn't go. Viruses that would kill all life on Earth, or huge things that make the atomic bomb. These terrible things. So what does our society has a right to make those things not investigatable by science because they're too dangerous. So our society decides that among those things is marijuana. That scientists should not be able to explore marijuana and MDMA and LSD and these certain molecules because there are things men should not know. And I think as a scientist, that's laughable. And as I often like to say, I got my degree in nuclear physics, and I like to say, if they trusted me with plutonium, why not LSD? My gosh.
So this makes no sense. So okay, if the war on drugs is not about protecting people from harmful substances, what is it about? Why are all these substances illegal? It's about control. And ultimately it's about control of what people can think. And it's the control of experience. It's essentially the state arrogating itself to the point where it says, certain states of consciousness are allowed and other states of consciousness are not allowed. And that's really what it comes down to. This is about cognitive liberty.
There are these, plants that have these molecules that humans may have used for thousands of years that produce visions and so on, and are often considered to be healing. In our cultures, we've demonized some of these substances and made them illegal, which I would consider to be unfortunate.
It's the state saying, don't go there, because if you take this entheogen or you take this psychedelic, you're going to have funny ideas. And funny ideas are very dangerous, especially if they don't fit in with, what we're saying should be, kind of the accepted cultural zeitgeist. So that's the danger of psychedelics, is they actually cause people to question the cultural paradigms and say, well, you know, maybe this is not consistent with, you know, maybe the revelations of psychedelics are not consistent with what Hollywood and Wall Street and the government and Main Street and, you know, religions and all these institutions are dishing out.
So the war on drugs is really a war on consciousness and who's allowed to think what. More importantly, I personally don't believe that anybody has the right to tell you what to do with your own body or what thoughts that you can think. That if you do not have the freedom to decide what happens to your own body and your own mind, then you really don't have freedom at its most basic, essential level.
You know, I think it's really ridiculous that they won't allow terminal cancer patients to take whatever fucking drug they want. I mean, you can't argue it's going to be, if you're going to die anyway, why can't you take any drug you like? And the extension of that is, once you pass a certain age, I don't know quite what that age should be, you should be able to do anything you fucking want to your body without being prosecuted. So scientists and old people should have free access to any drugs they want. I think I qualify in both counts. So, but you know, our society is, I don't even think that's enlightened. I think that's common sense. An enlightened society would take a look at these drugs objectively and say which ones can help, promote, and which, do we want a society based on alcohol and cocaine, or do you want a society based on LSD, MDMA, ayahuasca? Which of the drugs we're going to promote? And our society's picked, for some reason, the absolute worst drugs to make as its standards.
Potentially, psychedelic drugs could be for psychology what the telescope became for the science of astronomy.
In the right set and setting, with the right kind of psychotherapy support or religious support or whatever the context of the support is, and most importantly, what the person's intention is when they take it. If they're an addict or an alcoholic, they can take ayahuasca, they can take peyote, they can take these substances, and it will definitely help them to get over that. And in the case of something like ibogaine, it's even more specific. I mean, there's other things going on with ibogaine that might interrupt the addiction syndrome on the physical level.
For many people, actually, who were alcoholics and things like that, many have been cured by their use of psychedelics. So in some ways, it's the opposite of addiction.
Entheogens actually are almost the opposite of an addicting drug, in that sometimes a person will only take an entheogen once and have a very powerful experience and actually be freed from some other addictions or habits that he or she might have. And in fact, in some ibogaine research, an African drug called ibogaine, people are being taken off of heroin and alcohol with some good success where other methods have failed.
I discovered ibogaine pretty much 11 years ago on the internet back home to a friend of mine, which I gave a treatment. It was heroin. He was heroin addicted, so I treat him with the root, because I never use ibogaine for detox. No, I always use straight root. So when he went back to his country, that's how he learned about ibogaine, and he sent me an email. I'm like, whoa, that's very interesting. So ibogaine is an extraction from iboga. So you take the root itself, you do the extraction, and it became the first like a total alkaloid.
Ibogaine is very effective at treating certain kinds of addiction, opiates, methamphetamines, cocaine, and alcohol.
Ibogaine has 5 different therapies that we basically became aware in their use. One is an initiatory aspect, which is the psychospiritual, where you get into the deepening dreaming aspects, but you have no active addiction in the body. The second is for physical healing, things like herpes, asthma, lung problems, blocked energies in the system, scar tissue. Then there's also a mental treatment for disabilities around depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, traumas, sexual abuse. Then there's a reset therapy that we do with alcohol, cocaine, and methamphetamine. We separate that because those substances need to be out of the body for 24 to 72 hours prior to treatment. And then there's opiate. And in opiate detox, we can begin 12 hours after last administering of an opiate, and within 45 minutes it will completely control any symptoms of withdrawals.
I even do the healing for, let's say, for women who doesn't wanting to have kids, and let's say they try in hospital, and the doctor there say, you can't have kids anymore. But the woman is normal. It's like nothing's missing in the tummy. Why she can't have kids? I do the healing of that iboga.
Something that's been discovered recently by Dr. Deborah Mash and others is that there is a new neurotransmitter created in the brain after taking ibogaine called noribogaine. And it can stay in your system for up to 4 months. And that's the substance that they theorize is continually working on your psyche to make that reduction of cravings stay in place, so that over the long term you have time to break out of that cycle of addiction and become a new person.
Not only is it address the symptoms of withdrawals and discomfort, but it also works in the craving center of the mind. So the individual, by the time they've completed treatment, has no desire whatsoever within a 10 days to 2 week period to touch opiates.
See, that's pretty much the reason why I'm here in the West. I didn't just decide to come here. I love my country and we really peaceful there. Life is also great like here in Mexico. I would not just leave my people, whatever I were doing, my family, used to come here to hang out. Now, I had a call from the Spirit to spread the roots, the word of the root, iboga, which is them talking with ibogaine, to spread in the world, because it's not just for Africans, it's for anybody who needs it. If it was just up to me, I would just okay, let's go from city to city, clean up the streets, clean up the houses. We're gonna find those guys with drug addict. We're gonna find them and heal them all. Because that's the only way. That iboga and ibogaine is a last call for anybody who really wants to get help. You don't have to spend thousands and thousands of dollars or spend months in a clinic rehab and go back tomorrow and using the drugs. No, it takes just a couple of days to get it, and I'm ready to do that, to help anybody who wants to take it. Just one decision. That's it. That's all it takes.
But the thing is, I've also known many people who take a lot of psychedelics and they're heroin addicts, they're alcoholics. It hasn't helped them a bit. So, honesty behooves me to say that. This is not a miracle cure for addiction. All these things can do is open up an opportunity for the person to examine their lives and resolve to change, if that's what they want to do. But it won't compel them to change. It's not going to force anybody off drugs. So, you know, it's like a lot of other techniques for treating addiction, talk therapy or whatever. They work in some people and not in other people.
Since it's illegal in the United States, the only options that an addict has is to go out of the country or to do it illegally in the United States. And there are some people in the United States who are treating addicts illegally. You know, they're breaking the law by healing these people. However, most people go to other countries to take Ibogaine. I personally, I went to Mexico around the Puerto Vallarta area with an organization called AwakeningInTheDream.com. And that was a great experience for me. And the people there were super nice, and it was in a setting that I think was beneficial to the Ibogaine experience. In other words, it wasn't in a clinic, it was in a house, and I was with people who were very experienced at doing this, and I felt completely safe. But there are several clinics in Mexico doing this. Some of them are just right across the border in Tijuana.
And there's lots of clinics around the world that will take your money and give you Ibogaine. They've never taken Ibogaine. They don't know anything about drug addiction, and they have no idea what that individual is going through in that process. You know, and that just frightens the hell out of me. I mean, in comparison to what the model in the United States, this is not a return visit, a revolving door therapy house. We're hoping you can come here once, get rid of that addiction, and when you come back again to do more work with the Ibogaine, if it benefited you, you know, without an addiction in the body, because then you can go to the next level, and then you work to the next level. And this could be a real supportive, you know, this isn't like going to meetings every day and believing that you're never going to be anything less than what you are. This confirms that you are no longer in the body energetically. There is no physical addiction existing in the system.
It enables them to release from the addictive need, actually. They found themselves after their trips without the desire for junk. And they were all shocked, you know, like, oh my God, this is you know, because they were like waiting for the other shoe to drop, but then they actually felt like, wow, I am not hooked, you know. So there was something immediately engaging about it. On the other hand, it was also very psychologically challenging to begin with. And, you know, it took one into a very deep inner world. Maybe you were going to face some of the shadows that has been part of your addictive process.
This really sort of crosses over into the shamanic use of these things. I mean, the shaman is a person who learns through discipline to navigate in these realms. And this is the realm of, you know, he learns to pass through both ways, through the doors that the dead pass daily. I think that high doses of psychedelics or something like DMT is very close, probably. I mean, I've never had a near-death experience. I hope never to have one until I'm actually dying, you know. But people who have had them say that they're very similar to high doses of DMT. And there's even reason to think that the DMT, which our own bodies make, may be involved in the near-death experience, that, you know, in the state of stress on the mind and body that is produced when you're dying, it's not inconceivable that your brain releases a massive flood of DMT and you have this experience.
But all this still is mostly within the realm of speculation. We still don't really know enough about the normal concentrations of DMT in the body and what situations increase it and in what sorts of conditions the levels are decreased.
Where is DMT found in nature? Well, a better question would be where is it not found in nature? I mean, this is really interesting to me. The fact that DMT is so ubiquitous in nature, and it is from the chemical standpoint, structurally, it's the simplest of the psychedelics. It's a very, very simple compound. And in terms of biochemistry, it's only 2 steps away from tryptophan. Tryptophan is an amino acid. It's one of the essential amino acids. So it is universal. All living things have tryptophan. Now, not all living things have DMT, probably, but the enzymes that convert tryptophan to DMT, there are 2 main enzymes in this process, are also universal. I mean, I don't know how chemical we want to get here, but the basic idea is there's an enzyme that takes off the acid group of the amino acid, so it turns it from an amino acid into an amine. And then there's another enzyme that puts methyl groups onto the amines. So you get tryptophan, and then you get tryptamine, and then you get dimethyltryptamine, which is what DMT is. And this goes on, I think, very commonly. Well, these enzymes are certainly common. I mean, they're common in all cells practically. Do all organisms contain DMT? I think it's possible that all organisms might contain traces of DMT. There are many plants that contain DMT. We know of at least a couple hundred, and that's only because we've looked. You know, there are probably thousands of plants. In fact, my suspicion is that because tryptophan is so easily converted to DMT, I think if you went out with a sufficiently sensitive instrument, mass spectrometer or whatever, and just started sampling plants at random and shoving those through your gas chromatograph or whatever you're using, you would find traces of DMT in every plant. And you would also find it, we know it's very widespread in animals too. So we know it's in amphibians, we know it's in mammals, including us. We know it's in marine organisms, we know it's in fish. So it's odd that, well, maybe it's not odd. It's just a fact of nature that it's all over the place. And probably is about as close to being universal as anything is.
It's also related to serotonin. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter which occurs in all life and is most concentrated in the higher primates and most concentrated there in man. It is 5-hydroxytryptamine. While DMT is, as you mentioned, N,N-dimethyltryptamine. So there is a very close structural affinity between this extremely potent and exotic hallucinogen and the very common basis for ordinary consciousness, serotonin.
DMT and 5-methoxy-DMT and even beta-carbolines, which are the other component of the ayahuasca combination, do occur in the human brain, and they occur in other places in the human body, in the adrenal glands, for instance, probably in the gut, but they definitely occur in the human brain, especially in the pineal gland.
There are other forms of DMT other than the smokable kind. In fact, those other forms are the more traditionally used forms of DMT, such as ayahuasca.
Ayahuasca is remarkable because, as you probably know, it's combined from these 2 distinct plant species.
Its 2 principal ingredients are themselves inactive except in the presence of each other. So what we have in the case of ayahuasca is an example of a highly evolved folk pharmacology, and how a discovery like this was ever made in the first place is one of the challenging questions that anthropologists have to deal with. After all, in a square mile of Amazonian rainforest, it is not unusual to encounter 50,000 distinct species of plants. How then did these so-called primitive or pre-literate people make the connection between the combining of the bark of one with the leaves of another, boiled and put through a number of procedures to produce an intense visionary hallucinogen? This is an extremely interesting and, to this day, unanswered question.
It tastes horrible, by the way. It tastes, my version of what it tastes like is maybe 4-day-old espresso that someone had put out a cigarette in with a dash of lemon. And so you gag it down, and then after a while your mind starts to have a plasticity and an openness, and it remains that way for about 4 or 5 hours, which is can be quite beautiful. If you've seen any of the tapestries of the Inner Mind Cathedral in the DMT state, that extends it for hours. So it's kind of a shame not to take ayahuasca if you're going to do DMT, because geez, you can extend the journey to several hours.
Well, DMT is a tryptamine, so is LSD. LSD is a laboratory invention. It's a chemical modification of an ergot alkaloid. But in terms of their pharmacology, they're quite similar. They both impact certain kinds of serotonin receptors in the brain, through which most people propose that these drugs have their effects. I would say the main difference is that DMT is quite short-acting and LSD is quite long-acting. But in terms of on the spectrum of effects, they're quite comparable in terms of the perceptual and emotional and the cognitive responses to consuming the drug or the compound. Also, DMT is a compound that is found in all kinds of animals and plants, and LSD isn't a natural product. It isn't found in the animal kingdom or the plant kingdom. In ayahuasca, the effects of DMT begin a lot slower, probably within a half hour, maybe an hour, and they peak in around 2 to 3 hours, and they're usually resolved between around 6 hours or so. So even though it's a slower effect, the quality of the response is the same.
LSD was always a bit of a commitment, because that you've got at least 8 hours that you're committed to this altered state. And so you have to arrange your life wisely to support that. And this is just a little more manageable, I think, in some ways. It's also very clean and very clear. And you don't feel any body load afterward. You feel uplifted. You feel like vitalized. You feel like you need less sleep, and you feel that you've addressed yourself on a deep level. A lot of deep issues came up for me.
I've had experiences with ayahuasca and ibogaine. They've been very profound and important experiences in my life, and they've helped me, I feel, to grow on many levels. I've written about them extensively in my books, Breaking Open the Head, and 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl. I feel like they gave me insights into my personal psychology, visions about better paths to take. They kind of acted as kind of antidepressants that lifted my spirits up and made me see these other layers or possibilities of reality. So they've been very important experiences for me.
telepathic and group mind states are induced by this particular plant mixture. And it's particularly interesting in the light of the fact that the chemical constituents which make it go are in fact found endogenously in the human brain. These are not exotic compounds from the point of view of ordinary human brain chemistry. So there is a suggestion there that manipulation of neurohumoral compounds, brain neurotransmitters, and that sort of thing may in fact open the door to untapped areas of human potential.
One of the games my brother liked to play with the mushrooms was, in this dialogue situation, he was always saying, tell me something I can't possibly know, right? And that will validate that it's not me, that this is coming from. I don't know that he ever succeeded in getting it. It's very cagey, they're very tricky that way. It's, but occasionally they do seem to tell people things that they can't possibly know, or that they've never thought about in quite that way. Now it's come out, for example, that Crick's insight into the structure of DNA was assisted by LSD, and he reluctantly but finally admitted that was a big influence. And many computer scientists, Steve Jobs has said LSD's been very useful for his creativity. Kary Mullis, the Nobel Prize winner who figured out the PCR chain reaction, has been quite upfront about it. LSD gave him the ability to get down with the molecules and see what's happening. In some sense, there is a communication. In some sense, the question isn't even valid, because where do the boundaries between the self and the world exist? We're not really separate. I mean, we're part of this information field. And, this notion that consciousness, I do think that consciousness it's like a property of the continuum. It's like the old physicist concept of the ether or something. It kind of permeates everything, and it's not really localized in the human brain or necessarily even generated by the human brain.
Why does the brain require DMT for normal function if this is indeed true? Yeah, and it's hard to say. I think that perhaps one of the functions of ordinary levels of DMT is kind of like a, kind of reality thermostat. If you have a certain kind of narrow window of levels of DMT in the brain, it maintains this ordinary level of, perceptual, consensus reality that most of us live in. Kind of like the endomatrix in a way, as opposed to like an externally applied, psychological or, consciousness kind of matrix like in the movie. This is one that's internally generated.
But it may be that the brain is a place where it becomes focused and concentrated. The brain may be as much a receiver of the signal as it is a generator of the signal. Nobody can really say, but that model in some ways appeals more to me than the notion that it's all coming from the brain. The brain is more like a node, and there's this sort of field of consciousness that permeates everything, and to a certain degree, everything is conscious.
I think of the shaman as entering into this net of being in the higher worlds, in the heaven worlds, and that's why I've personified the net of being, this painting behind us, as this continuum of heads interlocking infinitely in all directions, because that points to being as a continuum, as a network, in a sense, to an infinite realm. And this is a part of the deep fabric of our being, I think, because we sense ourselves as souls related to many.
There is this everyday world, but you can be in a place where there is no you and still perceive the world. That scared me. Losing my ego was the scariest thing I ever, and I still don't like it.
A profound state which may be reached by use of these entheogens, psychedelics, hallucinogens, whatever you're going to call them, which is known as ego loss or ego death. Unfortunately, subsequent to the coinage of this term, ego has come to be used in a completely other sense. It has been used in the sense of pride, and that is not what ego death is about.
I mean, ego death would mean you lose your sense of I for good, and that's not what happens. They mean a temporary suspension of the ego when ego death is spoken of.
Ego death means the death of you as a concept, whereas we walk around thinking of ourselves as things. We think of, I am sitting in the chair, therefore, I am a thing, the chair is a thing. When we reach the realm of ego death, or ego dissolution, or whatever you're going to call it, there is no longer any perceived boundary between oneself and the chair. In this state, there are no things. There is just one continuous experience.
In some sense, all of experience is an illusion. Everything that we experience in the here and now and our state of being is a hallucination, an elaborate hallucination that our brains construct. We happen to call it consensus reality. But it's still, physics tells us that, the picture of reality that we build so that we can navigate through the world and not step in front of buses and stuff like that and do all those, the world doesn't really look like this at all. The brain constructs a model of reality that more or less maps onto reality. It's good enough that we can survive.
But we're focused in a kind of, constricted dimensional awareness of reality. And, for safety reasons mostly, and we don't necessarily want to know that we are actual one consciousness with all beings and things at all times. So, nevertheless, those dimensions are all open to our being. We have a complete freedom of the continuum of being.
If we change the nature, we have the model and we have the real world out here and we have the sensory neural interface that's taking this information in, interpreting it, and giving us the model. If we change the nature of the sensory neural interface a little or a lot, if we substitute, say, DMT for serotonin, the model of the world that we get changes radically. And who's to say that that's any less valid than the model that, the brain constructs for, for everyday purposes? So this idea that, it's all illusion, it's all hallucination. That's what experience is, That's why, in some ways, I sometimes get a little impatient with people that say, a drug experience cannot possibly have any spiritual validity. Well, I'm here to tell you that all experience is a drug experience. We're all on drugs all the time, largely because we're made of drugs, and that's what drives us. Experience is sort of the what issues out of this biochemical process of, all these neurotransmitters and hormones moving around our brain. It's drugs.
We've gotten very stuck on the idea that we're conscious and sentient and, you know, intelligent and have knowledge, and that nothing else in the world of nature really is like that. But actually, you know, we're a very young experiment on the planet. We're a young species, and this plant world has been around for a really long time. The fungus world, even longer than that. And they've developed, you know, a symbiotic meshworks of species interrelationship, very complicated diplomacy, interspecies diplomacy. And it may be that certain plants have been kind of anointed or given the role to be the diplomats and the teachers who work with the human species to help us to see if we can evolve to be less destructive before we sort of just lose our shit and top off the biosphere.
Maybe the ubiquity of DMT is you know, signature of consciousness in nature, or nature sending a message to, you know, the big brain stupid primates, you know, wake up, look around, it's everywhere, you know, mind is everywhere.
I think that their message is wake up, dummy, you know, before you kill us all here, on one hand. And the other hand, they're saying wake up to your own divinity, wake up to your higher capacities.
So they're talking to us every day, which is true. But no, we're not listening, because it's like when you get up in the morning, you go straight to work, you work after you know, your day, you get off, you go home, or you stop at the restaurant, eat a good meal, and you go home. That's it. You go to sleep. The next day, you do the same thing. So, to answer your question, herbs are spirits talking to us every day. Just be ready and to know what is it, what it's trying to tell me.
I mean, you have these experiences, and you seem to have a communication, right? And very often they present themselves as an intelligence, something outside yourself, you know, and you're communicating with it. You're having a dialogue or some feeling of, you know, an other that you're interacting with. Whether it is a illusion or not, it's hard to. It's really hard to know. Psychedelics sort of make people aware of realms that are less material, you know, that the real sort of, the really rewarding experiences are not necessarily what Wall Street or Madison Avenue or Hollywood wants to deliver to you. I mean, those experiences, and they're synthetic experiences just as much as a drug experience is a synthetic experience, but they're usually tied with some consumerist, you know, agenda. And I mean, this is part of the sort of the inconsistent attitude of society. I mean, they meaning, I don't know, the corporate hegemony or whatever. I mean, they want people to be addicted to things. They want people to consume things, and not necessarily to drugs, but drugs will do. I mean, they want people to drink and smoke and all these things, you know, and they want people to be addicted to their cars and computers and TV and all that. So, you know, a lot of what it's about is kind of keeping people entertained and focused on these sort of corporately massaged, corporately created versions of reality.
The business of culture, any culture, is to perpetuate its cultural models. And if the hallucinogenic plants have not been integrated into the cultural model, then they are definitely seen as dangerous forces for an unpredictable sort of social change. Now, if the hallucinogenic plants have been integrated into the cultural model, this is not then a problem, and this is the case with shamanism. Shamanism is the culturally sanctified institution of inner exploration via psychoactive plants. Where psychoactive plants are not present, shamanic institutions tend to become vitiated, to rely on ritual or ordeals or other methods of eliciting these ecstatic states.
Well, the contemporary artist, therefore, has felt a great kinship with the shaman, because the archetype of the contemporary artist is that they stand askance from or ajar from conventional culture. And therefore, these are the creative artists, we hope. Therefore, they contribute a different perspective on ourselves, and something that we can learn from. And I think that that's part of the role of sacred art, ultimately, is to show us a higher model of what we can be, so that we're pulled toward our highest potential, rather than having our negative or materialist sense reinforced. We get that through a lot of our other materialist and very rational culture.
Entheogens are inherently threatening to the culture. I mean, that's, I think, one reason that they're brutally suppressed, both when capitalist cultures or dominant cultures come on indigenous cultures. You know, they're usually bringing another religion, an outside religion, Christianity or whatever, usually incompatible with the indigenous practices. So that's the first thing to go, and the first thing to be attacked, and along with that goes the knowledge of these plants.
The church was concerned that the magic of the witches be seen as real, number one, and number two, entirely caused by the agency of the devil himself. And so the church downplayed the operational role that plants had in inducing these states, because, after all, if the devil cannot lead you astray without the use of plants, why, what kind of devil is it? So in our own historical tradition, there is a curious blindness to the efficacy of hallucinogenic plants.
You know, it is possible that as the visionary experience becomes more acceptable in our contemporary postmodern culture, more and more people may gravitate to those types of experience. And at the same time, we can already see that the traditional religious structures are in a lot of trouble. They're causing a lot of trouble in the world. It probably would be beneficial for there to be a kind of consciousness evolution out of fundamentalist belief systems. And I think that the shamanic experience might be helpful in that evolutionary process.
As institutions, what they have in common is they discourage individual thought, and they discourage critical thinking, and they discourage questioning. They encourage that, okay, here's a body of beliefs or cultural norms or, a largely accepted beliefs, and you're just supposed to accept it. Don't ask questions, sit down and shut up. Accept it and integrate it and be a good, citizen, consumer, whatever role is decided. Entheogens are inherently threatening because they enable people, or sometimes they compel people to reject that, and say, well, maybe there's more to life than, working in a cubicle for some faceless corporation so I can not have health insurance and die sick and, without a pension and, and just spend my time with that. Maybe it encourages people to, look for different purposes in life than that. And so that's really, I think, what's going on.
The problem with the psychedelics is that they dissolve cultural programming and hence inherently have a political charge about them.
And actually that's the weakness, of what I'm sort of beginning to call the death culture, and these things then actually become, in a sense, our own bioweapons, or if we're on the other side of this divide, then these plants, especially the plants, become very dangerous in this context. They're trying to suppress them, but you can't suppress them, and they're ways of changing hearts and minds, so they are definitely very, very dangerous. But they can be used in a creative way to counteract kind of the toxic message that mainstream culture puts out.
I put a lot of time into making sacred art in order to download the shamanic and entheogenic and meditative and just grace and dream and shamanic journey and all of these kinds of modes of and highly rational thinking about philosophically what are the implications of the worldview that I'm expressing and things like that. Because for me, the artist perhaps at their best could be I love that word scintilla, Terence always used, could be the scintilla of evolving consciousness, as we all can be, but they could express it visually.
And in fact, there are images that appear to be of the fly-agaric mushroom in some early Christian art. The fresco at Plain Coral is one example of this. And it appears to be Adam and Eve standing next to this big fly-agaric mushroom that has sprouts coming off of it. It's not depicted in exactly the way a fly-agaric grows, but the stalk is there in the cap of the mushroom, and it has white flecks on top. It looks very much like an Amanita muscaria mushroom. Now, this has been debated by art scholars, saying that no, this is just the style that was used, a figurative style to paint, a way to paint trees. But why, though? You have to ask, would you start painting trees that looked like mushrooms? Unless perhaps you were trying to get across another message in that painting. In the ceiling of the Hildesheim Cathedral in Germany, painted I think in 1100, this era, there's a striking image very similar to the Plain Coral fresco of Adam and Eve, again standing not next to a tree-like Amanita, but standing in front of what looks like a fly-agaric cap behind them, tilted on, so it's facing the viewer. So it's round like this, and Adam and Eve are standing in front of it. Not only is it perfectly round like an Amanita cap, not only does it have white spot, these are silver spots spread out over like the veil remnants, white veil remnants on an Amanita cap, but these are actually metallic hemispheres, silver metallic hemispheres that are attached to the painting. So they're actually raised bumps, just like you'll find on the cap of a mushroom. The veil remnants are are white flecks that can even be removed. So this was, in my opinion, this was an intentional clue by the artist to show people what was really being shown here, what the fruit of the Garden of Eden really was, according to the artist, and according to Allegro and Wasson as well, that the fruit of the Garden of Eden was, in fact, the fly agaric mushroom.
It's just such a damn attractive mushroom, I have to say. It distinguishes itself by its beauty. I can't think of a more beautiful mushroom, really. At the same time, I can think of one that takes you a lot higher in terms of its psychedelic potency and entheogenic potential. I've never had much of a holy experience on an Amanita. It was slightly more of a deliriant and a body wank than something that would elevate you to the heavenly spheres,
It's the iconic mushroom, in a sense. I mean, it's the archetypal mushroom that goes way, way back to at least the Paleolithic. We know that Siberian shamanism is where the whole thing is thought to have originated, and that was a lot of that constellated around Amanita. And, the classic shamanic motifs of the ascending the world tree and having the axis mundi that links the celestial and the earthly and the underground realms. And in Siberian shamanism, this is often depicted as a mushroom.
I've encountered the Amanita muscaria mushroom and its symbolism actually in the material around the Finnish Kalevala, the national epic of Finland. It was collected together as an oral tradition in the 19th century and was called the Kalevala. And it's the ancient legends of Finland. And there's an artifact or an idea or a concept in the Kalevala called the Sampo. And the Sampo is kind of this magic mill that's capable of producing anything you wish. And it's really a cosmological metaphor for the starry sky centered on the pole star. And the stars are called the ciphered cover, so it's envisioned as this huge sort of umbrella-like thing that spins slowly with the central axis coming down. So it's also a huge image of the Amanita muscaria mushroom as a cosmological metaphor.
Muscimol, which is the active main psychoactive principle in Amanita muscaria, is a very potent GABA agonist. So it interacts specifically with these receptors and not at all with the serotonin receptors, except possibly indirectly. So how can Amanita muscaria produce these transcendent experiences? And there are several possible answers. Maybe they don't. I personally am not familiar enough with Amanita muscaria to say that they do. My own experience with Amanita was very limited because I didn't enjoy it, but it didn't seem like a transcendent experience at all. It seemed like a cheap drunk in a way, but I dealt with, I was eating fresh mushrooms, and it's almost always taken dried. I think there's a great deal of chemical variation in the mushrooms, both geographically. There's geographic variation. The mushrooms in the Himalayas and in Siberia may not be the same as the ones in Colorado, just from a chemical angle. So there are many chemical races, of these mushrooms. Some of them may contain true psychedelics. Some of them may contain tryptamines and or beta-carbolines. There's some evidence that they do, these DMT and this kind of thing, do show up in some of these things, some of these amanitas. It's a complicated picture. Nobody has sorted out, somebody really needs to go through and do two things. They need to collect mushrooms very carefully from different parts of the world and do chemical profiles to see if they can define a chemical race, or are there certain races that are high in these tryptamines. Someone also needs to look at the way that they're prepared, because I think I've talked with people, and you have too probably, who insist that they are really very psychedelic, but you have to dry them a certain way, and they have to be dried over a fire, they have to be, and the fresh mushrooms don't get it,
The fly agaric mushroom, unlike, say, psilocybe species, a psilocybin mushroom, where you can pretty much rely on, you can go by weight. If you take the mushroom, a certain amount will give you pretty much a certain level of experience. With the fly agaric, you have no such guarantee. You can have a mushroom as big as a dinner plate that will give you virtually no experience at all, or you can have one much smaller that can knock your socks off, metaphorically speaking.
It's because the mushroom contains both muscimol, which is the active ingredient, and a substance called ibotenic acid, which is far, far less active, but much more toxic. Once it reaches your liver, the liver starts dismantling it, and the first thing it does is a decarboxylation process which turns it into muscimol, and then it excretes it. So you can actually, depending on the amount of ibotenic acid in the initial sample, you can actually excrete more of the active principle, muscimol, than you ate. And so if you were to pass on your urine to somebody else, you'd get higher than you did. Purely because, and of course you'll pass on some ibotenic acid too, which he will metabolize into muscimol. And so in Siberia, this is passed from person to person, not rather than being recycled. And they get 5 or 6 people high on the same mushroom.
This is very important. This may be the secret of Amanita, because it seems to me, from what you were saying, that it's not simply that it goes through. There's a filtering, and there's a detoxification process. So the first collection after you eat it has probably got a lot of things cleaned out of it that might make for an uncomfortable trip. It may also, this is pure speculation, but it's possible that some of the downstream effects of taking these GABA agonists, which is what the Amanita, it might induce the production of endogenous tryptamines, DMT plus beta-carbonates, so that the person who ate that urine or drank that urine after this process might be getting a lot of things that is not in the mushrooms, but it's actually secondary metabolites that are produced by the eating of the mushrooms. So you get the mushrooms, you eat the mushrooms, and you get all these feedback loops happening, and you get possibly things excreted in the urine, possibly these tryptamines and beta-carbonates. I don't know that this is possible, but it's completely reasonable to speculate.
There is actually a Tibetan text which is a retelling of the Hindu myth of how Amrita was first made by churning the ocean. But in the Tibetan version, the bodhisattva who's supposed to be looking after the Amrita doesn't look after it very well, and this demon comes along and steals it. And he doesn't just drink it all, he drinks it and replaces it with his own urine. And then the Buddhas decide that the bodhisattva Vajrapani, who is looking after it, should drink the urine. And he does. And he becomes dark blue, surrounded by flames and ornamented with snakes.
stepping out. That's what the mystical experience is. It's one of ecstasy. And whilst it's difficult to look at specifically at least the Gnostic and pagan initiations and go, oh, this was what was used, and we don't have that. We can guess, we don't. What we do know is that an initiation, well, first of all, the word, certainly in the Greek word that gets used, doesn't mean, like our word, the start of something. It comes from telos, and it means kind of a glimpse of the end of something. So what's happening to you in an initiation is that you're getting an experience of where you're going. So and then you come back and then you make the journey back to that place and you're finding it in yourself. Now, one of the things that psychedelics does is it gives you a glimpse of something which has been kind of given to you from the outside in. You've needed to ingest this thing and something's happened to your consciousness. It's a very powerful way of doing that. So the idea that you could have an initiation, a glimpse of the end, through something which is taken into you, through psychedelics, also through the influence of a teacher or a ritual, or maybe all of it, and then you're on the journey to find that in yourself, because it's already in you. That's what I think is going on, one way or another.
It may be the case that there were mystery traditions that made use of psychedelics, and so we've lost track in our official history of what that use was and what went on. We don't know what they were doing in Egypt. We don't know what the Jews were doing in Sinai. So there's a lot of kind of alternative archaeology and anthropology, which sort of tries to work through these possibilities. And it may be that early Christianity had, aspects of a mushroom cult, that may have appeared in these artworks, which definitely are, some of them really are very suggestive of mushrooms. However, I think that sometimes there's a tendency in the psychedelic community to almost become like, entheogenic fundamentalists and think that all visionary experience, was mediated by the psychedelic plants, and that the origin of all religions was based in, the experience of using these substances. And it may be the case, we just don't know. And it may not be the case, because people have visionary experiences, without psychedelics. I mean, diet, fasting, drumming, there are all sorts of, there's a whole range, yoga, there's a whole range of types of experiences that produce mystical visions, sense of unity with the cosmos. So I'm a little resistant to a strain that I often encounter in the psychedelic underground of kind of fundamentalism around these experiences, that they were the origin of all genuine religion or whatever. So, but they probably played more of a part than the official story gives credit to.
When religions come in contact with a real mystery, with a really numinous thing, they don't like that, because numinous things are inherently dangerous and threatening, and a lot of religion has to do with controlling people, and there needs to be a distance between God or the numinous archetype, whatever that is, and the people, and that's usually the priestly hierarchy and the infrastructure around that, and the sort of infrastructure that filters the message.
One of the things that stood out in my research in Christianity was the use of the Eucharist. That is, going back to the Last Supper and Jesus' purported words at the time when he dipped the bread and said, "This is my body, eat it and have life in you. Unless you eat this, you will not have life in you. This is my blood," and he handed the cup of supposed wine and said, this is my blood, and unless you drink this blood, you will not have life in you. Unless you eat my body and drink my blood, you will not have life in you. And this is stressed over and over, especially in John, the book of John, in the New Testament. So what could this mean? What is this all mere symbol? Why degrade, ostensibly degrade a high spiritual experience by likening it to eating the flesh and blood of another human being? That seems counterintuitive and completely beside the point, unless these were symbols for something else, for another substance.
The Christian Eucharist promises a lot and delivers very little in terms of, in other words, you have to believe to get much out of the Christian Eucharist. And if you believe, then you may get, you won't get a psychedelic experience, but you will get something, an affirmation of faith or a feeling that you're, in communication with the Creator. Frankly, to be honest, I don't believe. I was raised Catholic, but it never made any sense to me, and so I don't believe, so I can't really tell you what a devout Christian gets from the Eucharist. What's different about psychedelics is they do deliver something. They deliver an experience if they're taken in the right set and setting. And I think one of the main things that sets them aside from, or that distinguishes them from the Eucharist, is you don't have to believe. In fact, I tell people faith is not necessary, to experience what psychedelics have to teach. In fact, that's an impediment. Get rid of your faith. Approach it like a scientist, You don't have to believe. You can be as skeptical as you want. You can take the substance in, you can experience it, and you can make your own judgments what it's about.
If Paul and other people are eating the body of the God and having incredible visionary, Paul says, again, it just completely contradicts the idea of a historical Jesus, because he says, everything I know about Jesus came to me by revelation. Where's this coming from? What is the source of his experiences? I wouldn't be at all surprised. A chap called John Allegro many years ago wrote a book, The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, which was about precisely this. He believes that the cultic meal of sharing the book was people getting together and eating some psychoactive substance together and having revelations of the Holy Spirit, what have you. So I'm open to any investigations and whatever evidence comes up. I think it's, through personal experience myself, one of the most powerful ways to, Aldous Huxley himself, when in is it Heaven and Hell?
Doors of Perception.
Doors of Perception. When he looks at the bamboo chair, I think it is, and he says, I suddenly, and this is a man who spent his entire life writing about the religious traditions of the world, the mystical traditions of the world, but he never actually had an experience. And here he was on mescaline, I believe, looking at this chair suffused with light, and he says, here all these words that people had used before, like grace and all these suddenly I was having that experience.
Alan Watts the same, again a great scholar, actually had the experience in this way. So if that's happening to people today, I think we can safely assume it's been happening to people for a very, very long time.
Yeah.
Shamanism is like a universal human dispensation wherever people live in connection with their native land, and it doesn't have to be through plants either. There are tribes that don't use plants, that just do all-night ceremonies, ritualistic drumming. There are all sorts of different ways to get people into altered states, and actually we're learning more and more about brainwave patterns and theta states and alpha states and so on. So I think that as Andrew Weil talks about, the desire, the sort of almost the necessity for people to change their consciousness and experience other states of consciousness seems to be very basic to our human nature. And if people aren't given constructive and creative outlets for those types of experience, they'll choose destructive and negative ones, just because it's just almost natural that we would want to have different types of consciousness experience.
Anybody's experience, their subjective personal experience of the mystical, has to be considered valid in some respect. They may have a different terministic screen, a set of words that they use to describe these mystical experiences, and maybe sometimes we don't always agree with those because of the baggage that's associated with them. But we still have to be open to the truth from those experiences before we completely just throw the baby out with the bathwater.
A mystical experience by any means whatsoever, you know. And if you can do Sufi dancing and attain a state of mystic bliss by finding your center and being a vortex, like a gyroscope of being, you know. I think there are numerous ways that people sort of align themselves with this mystic reality. But I happen to think that entheogens and psychedelics are a powerful way that could more safely be integrated into, you know, the sort of initiatory experiences that people call into their lives and stuff. And I think that the usefulness of the substances may eventually, as if humanity can evolve itself and mature itself, there may be an application, you know, in the future for these substances.
And it's that ability to take what works and leave behind. That's what the evolution of culture is. But you don't abandon the past, all the beautiful music and the buildings and the traditions. We just see it differently.
When the Spanish Inquisition got to the New World and they found these Aztecs, you know, eating mushrooms and having a jolly old time and having these ecstatic experiences and all that, I mean, as if that wasn't bad enough, but then they were calling it the flesh of the gods. Teonanacatl was the Aztec term for the mushrooms, which meant flesh of the gods. And this just enraged the clerics, and they just, you know, this was like so blasphemous, it couldn't be tolerated. And so they really, you know, reacted more brutally than they might have otherwise reacted to try to suppress this thing, because, you know, they just couldn't have this kind of thing. The parallels were too striking. And their Eucharist didn't do much, and the Aztec Eucharist, you know, delivered big time. So that was another reason why it had to be suppressed.
With the communion, where you take the wine and the bread, it works for people because it's done in a ritual context. People do have profound experiences, but I think very often, certainly over time, you know, it's a bit of a letdown, really. What is probably the case originally is that the wine would have been suffused with something, and also that the bread itself, there's a psychedelic fungi.
Well, that's where LSD is synthesized from ergot of rye.
Yeah.
And they believe that at certain points, when the bread was infected, and the medieval St. Vitus dance, for example,
yeah,
if the funguses attack the crop before it's turned into bread, the bread itself
becomes psychedelic.
And there were many eruptions in the Middle Ages, in particularly damp summers, when the ergot would flourish, when people would go kind of crazy.
If Jesus, say, were a shaman or a hierophant, which in the Greek term is what he was, a revealer of the mysteries, and he had a mystery, he said, I have a mystery, and he reveals his mystery to whom he chooses. Well, so he acted like a shaman, and perhaps even a higher stage higher than a shaman, because shamans aren't necessarily spiritual, in my understanding, and often aren't. But Jesus Jesus' mission was intensely spiritual, and he wanted to take people to heaven. Because he said, where I go, you will go also. The things I do, you will do also, and greater things even than I do. So, the fact that you could take this mushroom, this flesh and blood-like mushroom, and ascend to a heaven of light and love and bliss makes a very literal connection for me to Christianity and to the secret message that I think Jesus was handing out, not to the mass, not to the masses, but to the inner circle.
And this is the problem with the ancient pagan mysteries in general. They were mysteries. Everybody who participated was sworn to secrecy. And what's incredible, the mysteries of Eleusis were celebrated for 1,000 years in the Greek world. Many people, Roman emperors, Cicero, Seneca, all the greats, were initiates. None of them broke their oath and told us what happened. But we know that initiates drank a drink before they began on the sacred way to Eleusis, which was a painful purgatorial process. They were beaten by people with rods. It was meant to be a visceral, physical experience, and I feel that it was certainly heightened by fasting. So whatever, if they did take anything, then we know that would have been intensified, because it always is when you fast beforehand. Archaeologists have found opium pipes at Eleusis, so we've got enough hints to know. And the ancients were master pharmacopists. They knew all of the intoxicating, and it, as Tim says, it came out of the shamanic tradition.
In the heart of the Greek mysteries, the cradle of Western civilization, there was the Eleusinian mystery cult, and you had the enactment of I guess Demeter and Persephone and all this going into the underworld, and then at the height of this maybe 6-day ceremony or something, they took a psychedelic, which they called the kykeon.
There is an illustration. It's used on Robert Graves' Greek myths, which is one Maenad, who were the female followers of Dionysus, holding up a mushroom.
Yeah.
So there are numerous hints that this was going on. I wouldn't be at all surprised if it's...
I'd go further. I'd say I'd be surprised if it wasn't true.
Yeah.
What we can't say, and the reason that Peter and I haven't pushed it in our research, is because if you're coming out and saying that Jesus doesn't exist, it's such a confronting thing for most people that we've tried to keep to everything we can absolutely meticulously back up. But here is another possibility which others have looked into much more deeply than we have, and yet really, it would be such a surprise to see such a powerfully transformative process going on that didn't draw on this in some way, because they didn't have the same taboos which we've now got around changing consciousness.
Yeah.
And now you can look at Socrates' whole allegory of the cave and things like that, and you can, where people were just being in their cave and noticing the shadows and thinking that was the world, and then somebody turned around and they went outside and they saw the sun, and it's like, oh my God. He came back and wanted to tell all of his friends about it, and they absolutely wouldn't look toward the light, no matter what he did, they just wanted to stay entranced in their shadow worlds.
We are in this cave, we are watching shadows on the wall and mistaking them for reality, whilst the true source of light is from the mouth of the cave. And Plato even says, what would happen if a wise person came from the sunlight into the cave and said to people, look, you're just looking at shadows, this is not the real world? And then he says they would probably kill him.
So they say basically that's what happens with the mystic, and they've seen the light in a sense, and they're trying to tell their brothers and sisters, about the reality of their own sort of higher dimensions.
The way to understand religion is you've gone from a powerfully transformative event where you would take these psychoactives in a ritual context, probably alongside some sort of ritual death, and your state of consciousness utterly transformed.
Yeah.
To a little bit of white wafer and some tiny sip of wine in a context where you're going to go back and sing.
Well, I think it
hymns.
must always be the function of organised religion to neuter, to emasculate the mystical experience. Because what you don't want is people having their own access to the divine. So if people are taking a divine and then having their own personal act, they don't need you.
Well,
the whole point of organised religion is to mediate the divine. They are the intermediaries between you and God. That's the way organised religion works. So it must always, and I think it happened in Hinduism with Soma.
We were looking at the fly agaric mushroom, at which Gordon Wasson believed was the Soma. But at any rate, whatever Soma is, and I don't believe it's the Muskimo, I really don't. I believe it's more like psilocybin, or Steve Hager has even said it's cannabis. You know, if you read about it, it's like obviously cannabis. So at any rate, it was some kind of psychedelic, and it was a way for them to basically make contact with the divine.
The ninth mandala of the Rig Veda is entirely devoted to singing the praises of Soma, and yet we do not know what Soma is or was. R. Gordon Wasson spent a considerable portion of his life researching this problem and reached the conclusion that Soma was Amanita muscaria, a mushroom that is symbiotic to pine and birch trees throughout much of the North Temperate Zone. However, scholars have cast doubt on his identification of Soma.
It's quite possible that there were several different psychoactive plants used in sacramental forms in ancient India. In the most developed forms of Vajrayana Buddhism, the amrita that was used was called Panchamrita, which means the fivefold amrita. So there were 5 separate plants, I think. In the literature, in the scriptures, we're told of 5 different meats: horse, cow, dog, elephant, and man, the great meat. But I believe that these were different plants, and that when you had the fivefold elixir to drink, and you also ate in ritual context, ate a bite of each of the 5 meats, I think that was really drinking a concoction of 5 different plants and eating a little of the raw plant. And I believe that they were all different psychoactives.
Some sort of plant substance was prepared and ingested by a priesthood who then used the ecstatic experience induced by that plant as the basis for all of their metaphysical and philosophical speculations on the nature of the universe.
If you read the Rig Veda, all the Vedic hymns, out of 1,000, I think 990 are hymns to Soma. It is the blood of the gods, it's the vision of eternity, it's the white gleaming swan of eternity. It's like, but now in Hindu culture, Soma is just a milky drink. And I think the same process has gone on. People have realised if you want to actually control people, you have to shut down their access. And it's certainly what happened with Gnosticism. Gnosticism said, no, God is in you. Like Paul said, Christ is in you. That's fatal for organised religion, because then everybody can have their own personal relationship with Christ. Why do I need to go to church to experience Christ? I can do it on my own.
psychedelic experience is as central to understanding your humanness as having sex, or having a child, or having responsibilities, or having hopes and dreams, and yet it is illegal. We are somehow told we are infantilized. We're told, you can wander around within the sanctioned playpen of ordinary consciousness, and we have some intoxicants over here. If you want to mess yourself up, we've got some scotch here and some tobacco and red meat and some sugar and a little TV. But these boundary-dissolving hallucinogens that give you a sense of unity with your fellow man and nature are somehow forbidden. This is an outrage. It's a sign of cultural immaturity, and the fact that we tolerate it is a sign that we are living in a society as oppressed as any society in the past.